Thanks everyone for having me today. What I'd like to discuss with you is the hybrid WAN proof of value journey that we're taking at DHL this year. Kind of give you an overview, not so much based on technology or details into design, but what are some of the considerations that we need to take into account for an organization like ourselves when investigating and move to a hybrid WAN architecture. So firstly, a little bit about DHL, just to understand the complexity or the size of our organization. As I had previously mentioned, internally we have about 5 different business units: Express, supply chain, global forwarding and freight, as well as our PEP business units, which is parcel and e-commerce, and then obviously our back office function, global business services like HR, et cetera. We're 10,000 sites across 200 countries, or more than 200 countries globally, and 500,000 employees. So quite a large estate, and that's not that we do business in 200 countries, we actually have footprint. So it can be a daunting task to try and standardize on a single technology globally. So as part of what does our telecommunications network look like? As I mentioned earlier, about 7 years ago, we started some outsourcing initiatives where we started to procure managed services across WAN, LAN, wireless LAN, fixed voice, as well as mobile and data voice. Some of those vendors that we have, Orange, Telmex, BT, T-Systems, AT&T, and Vodafone. Now some of them have their own individual regions. Some play more of a niche in specific regions, so it's split up into 1 or 2 different providers. Some have multiple regions. Some provide all the services, or they just provide partial. So it's not the same across everywhere. But one of the hurdles we have to overcome with that is that we built these contracts based on capabilities, not on vendor-specific technologies. So we didn't go out and tell everybody, you got to deploy a Cisco this or a Riverbed that. We basically said, you got to make sure that you use OSPF, and gave them specific kind of technical capabilities that they needed to provide so that we could have end-to-end compatibility. But obviously that change is coming with SD-WAN moving forward. So what are some of the key trends and challenges that we have? I think we talked about this a bit earlier. Obviously, we see the rise in cloud services. I think one of the most telling statistics is that there's a projected increase of private cloud, moving from 49% to 68% by 2020. And on converse, there's a decrease in public cloud to about from 50% to about 32% by 2020. So we're going to continue to move more towards infrastructure as a service and software as a service. And instead of doing that internally, we're going to move to more of that being external. Additionally, as we already talked about, we see capacity increasing at 20% annual rate. For us internally, what that means is UCC is being deployed out widely, as well as the immersive video, and bulk software updates are starting to become a concern. With the Windows 10 rollout, we see that we're going to start seeing patches that are upwards of 4 gig, and how are we going to maintain that on our network? Additionally, something we already discussed was the multimedia transport, looking at the broadband, the 4G, and the LTE, as well as with 5G coming, the enterprise is just more willing to accept those access for production traffic now. And obviously with all of that, you start seeing that with capacity increasing over 2 years or next 3 years, it's going to double, and that's going to drive our costs up. So we had to decide what was our next direction to go from an architecture perspective. We basically looked at, we had about 4 options or that we could look at. The first was WAN optimization. We see caching and compression of data in order to reduce capacity of our WAN at the edge. We have about 300 appliances deployed globally. Obviously, we have 10,000 plus sites. That's not the majority of our estate. There's a little typo there. It shouldn't say that it's seen as strategic. It's actually seen as tactical in our mature markets. The reason for that is that we're able to just procure bandwidth for cheaper than put additional infrastructure in and make our network more complex and more difficult to support. So there's limited benefit for us. It does provide an immense benefit in certain areas, but it's just not a benefit across the globe for us. The second is overbuilding the WAN. So some companies have taken the approach of looking at overbuilding capacity, basically just putting more than sufficient capacity if you need, and stop managing the actual growth of capacity. Stop looking at that 60%, 70%, 80% utilization. Just pay for more capacity. Obviously, in mature markets, as I said, that's possible. That's what's being done. But in those emerging markets, it doesn't work. It's way too expensive, and therefore upgrade isn't always an option. Third is quality of service. Looking at the prioritization of traffic on our network. It's this isn't so much a solution as far as how do we get more capacity, but how do we protect our network? And how do we look at the traffic that's for a core business function versus that traffic that provides back office function. We already started to deploy QoS to a large scale at DHL. It's already out there, but it doesn't answer the capacity question. It only protects our existing business functions. And lastly, of course, is the hybrid WAN. Enabling our intelligent routing across the network, as well as using multipath functionality, and simplifying the operations of the WAN. And obviously, all of these will play a key role in how we meet those challenges over the next few years. But in reality, hybrid WAN is going to be what's going to help us keep pace with the trends. So what is hybrid WAN? I'll just cover this. I won't go too deep into it. There's a general definition there, but I think what's important is that as an organization, we need to define what hybrid WAN means to us. For us, it's offloading of internet traffic, software as a service, internet infrastructure as a service, as well as offloading that back office traffic in order to save costs. Others, it may be something different. It could be more security, it could be more reporting metrics, those sort of things. But for us, essentially, we're looking to save costs. And ultimately, that's delivered via software-defined layer. But internally in our organization, we still have some concerns about SD-WAN. While it's enabled us to deliver hybrid WAN at scale, right? There's still some questions. For one, hybrid WAN or software-defined WAN in itself isn't widely known throughout the organization. We already talked about the market maturity, where it's at. It's really, with 30 vendors or 30 plus vendors out there, and a lot of the vendors moving around, being acquired, Cisco acquiring Viptela being one of them. It's just still a changing area. As well as managed services and what we talked about, 95% of those are still insourced. Managed services are still being developed, and obviously we're a managed services organization, so it's a concern for us. Likewise, operational efficiencies. I remember that one of the very first discussions that I had about SD-WAN with a vendor was about the operational efficiencies that it would bring us. But as a managed service, that's low-hanging fruit for most, but for us, it really has limited benefit. It doesn't provide much for us. And then you look at existing service level agreements. If we already have a managed service for our WAN transport, what does it do to existing service levels of that if we insource SD-WAN overlay? And lastly is security. Well, it has an additional layer of security with segmentation of our WAN, that kind of multi-tenancy type of look and feel. It also adds additional risks because it's pushing internet more out to the edge, and that brings risks into our network. So what is our approach and our objective? So our objective is to investigate whether the technology is fit for purpose, and so that we can make a decision on how we move forward. Just click through these, save a little bit of time. So the first thing we did is gather some requirements from our business, as well as look at the technical requirements from our IT team and our suppliers. We built use cases of those based on those requirements. Then we engaged our suppliers to identify pilot sites that we could do a proof of concept. We also asked them to provide design and solutions that they would use, as well as the build and run costs for those solutions. Additionally, after that, we ran proof of concept. We're right in that proof of concept phase right now to test those use cases and those requirements. And then we run a cost-benefit analysis, essentially looking at and comparing the two models of an existing WAN transport service versus a hybrid WAN service. And then lastly, we have to deliver that proof of value statement. What is the what is the financial and the technical value for us as an organization to move that forward. If we look at some of our requirements, these are to some extent a bit more, let's say, general. There's some things that are not necessarily specific to our organization, but so I won't go through all of them individually. But obviously, we have business, functional, managed service layer, as well as financial that we need to consider. I'd say probably two of the key things that we got is that we needed to provide cost savings for short-term ROI. So that we can deploy this as a tactical solution, and we focus on those countries and those areas where we see the most cost benefit. So what are some of the use cases that we looked at? The first is user internet access, offloading of user internet access, our cloud proxy traffic, as well as the guest network access and BYOD access. I think what's important to mention here is having that cloud proxy vendor. If you're really looking at moving to a hybrid WAN and moving services to the internet, you don't want to have to deploy proxy infrastructure at the edge. So you either need something that's going to be built into your edge CPE, or you need to move to a cloud service provider. I think it's really important when talking about SD-WAN and hybrid WAN technology. And we're just going through that process now. We standardized on Zscaler last year, and there's a migration process we're going through at this moment. The next is us looking at access cloud services. So, those infrastructure as a service that we talked about, software as a service. I think the most important thing to mention here is that if you look, you don't see the data center at all, right? There's no data center on that diagram. So if you think about all that traffic being backhauled over your network, and it doesn't even reside in our data center, I think it's most important. It's one of the most telling stories of capacity that we can save today. And then obviously there's those back office applications that we want to test, that email, app patching, OS patching, antivirus updates, SharePoint services, and being able to do that dynamically over the internet via VPN. And lastly for us is looking at those alternative paths, either active-active, active-passive, or running internet as a DR for some of our core business functions. This is really actually a synopsis of a really good article. You have a chance to read it from Gartner. It's SD-WAN is causing disruption at the WAN edge. I thought this was really important, even though I say we didn't dive too much into technology, but regardless, you have to know what you're procuring, right? And I think if you're looking at a managed service, what you need to focus on is not the feature sets, not those details of a technology, but look at what the capabilities and performance are of a solution. What Gartner has basically done is breaking them down into core competencies. So you have your router, which is your incumbent, of Cisco and Huawei. And basically this is a subset of vendors. They're really looking at who they see as being the biggest players out there. And then you have WAN optimization services, who are vendors who currently have a service and they're kind of pivoting into the SD-WAN field. And WAN virtualization and security are also those pivot players. As well as then the SD-WAN, which are those pure play vendors, the Nuage, Viptela as well, although that's changing, but that are out there. I think one of the best things, if you look at this, at least for us from a DHL perspective, if you look at that table where you have the type of vendors across the top and you have the capabilities there on the y-axis, obviously SD-WAN vendors are very strong in their own technology, right? This is what they came up doing. They know it the best. From a DHL side, we're not really looking at those virtualization vendors at this point or those security vendors. But we are considering the WAS. I mean, they're very strong, right? And we already have WAS. We have Riverbed in-house, so it's something that is a huge consideration for us. It's a bit challenging for us at the moment that those routing incumbents are not as strong in SD-WAN as we'd like for them to be. But as I said, what I think is the most interesting here is that with that acquisition of Viptela, you're going to see this diagram change over the next year or two, right? As long as, Cisco and that phased approach that they have in incorporating them. And in reality, if it's going to be our next evolution of network architecture, we're going to look at replacing that WAN CPE router at the branch office, right? So either those WAS players are really going to come into that routing vendor estate, or we're going to see those routing vendors mature in their SD-WAN estate. So our proof of concept results. We've only done a couple of sites, had a proof of concept. We have a couple pending. So we haven't, definitely haven't completed any of it, but we have already started to see some real value. The initial sites that we've done, as I said earlier, we've seen a 40% to 50% decrease in our traffic for those sites. And as I also mentioned, we've seen that improved application response with email, just because there's no longer queuing over the internet. So, well, it's only two statistics there. I think it's quite telling as far as where we're moving with the technology. And we'll see that mature as we get more into different POCs in different regions. So the cost-benefit analysis, I kind of already talked about this, so I don't want to necessarily deep dive too much into it. You're obviously going to want to look at your existing WAN costs versus what that reduction would be through that avoidance. One key thing is you need to remember is that if you want to downgrade circuits, you need to take into account those potential contract penalties if you have a contract signed for 2 to 3 years. Additionally, you want to look at the projected WAN costs. It's supposed to increase 20% over the next 3 to 5 years. What we're saying is because we've seen that 40 to 50%, we can probably look at that decrease at being, or that increase, projected increase only being about 10%, right? The next thing is the internet circuits. I believe I talked about that earlier when we did the panel, but what's really important there, I think, is that you need to also, if your company requires that you have a standalone firewall, we have pretty strict policies around security, and so if you're going to require additional firewall infrastructure, you need to take that into account, as well as if you haven't moved to a cloud proxy solution, then you have proxy infrastructure that you may need at the site as well, so that can be quite important. And then managed WAN services. You have an existing managed MPLS network that you pay for. You're gonna move into a world, and this is where the managed services I think still need to develop from our suppliers and those traditional managed service providers. But are we gonna have just one WAN charge, or are we gonna have a SD-WAN only service charge, or are we gonna have two? Or how are they gonna be incorporated? So that's yet to be seen, but we have to keep that into account, that we could be seeing multiple charges from our suppliers. And then lastly is the infrastructure. So you're either going to refresh to your traditional WAN transport router, or you're going to refresh that SD-WAN infrastructure. And by that could be a transport router plus an overlay device, right? So many things to keep in mind there. And lastly is our sourcing approach. We consider, are we going to insource the solution or outsource it, and what are some of the differentiators there? Keeping it in-house means that we would manage just the SD-WAN overlay. The WAN transport would still be supported by our suppliers. If we outsource it, it means that we have full end-to-end hybrid WAN managed service from our suppliers. Some of the differentiators for us is cost. So just out of any managed service contract that we've done, whether it be for video or unified communications or just WAN in itself, what we traditionally see is that internally, if you look at just the operational support, we can traditionally do it cheaper. And the reason for that is because the suppliers, one, they have to make revenue, but two, they also have to have charges around all of the managed service pieces that they provide, all of that billing, all of the capacity management. There's people all involved with that, right? So there's multiple things that need to be considered. The next one is end-to-end SLA. Since we don't manage the WAN transport internally, if we insource it, we can't offer an end-to-end SLA internally. We can only offer an SLA for that SD-WAN overlay. If it's outsourced, then obviously they're able to provide us a true end-to-end SLA, so there's a big positive there on the supplier side. Next is the support. I kind of see this to be a bit even. The reason for that is that from internally, what we've seen is that any service where we have to manage application traffic, right, specific internal application traffic, we tend to do a better job. We have an intimate knowledge of our own applications that are our core business than our suppliers do. So that's a plus for us on that side. On the side of the support for the supplier is that they have the ability to put hands and feet on the ground. So us as IT services, we don't have legal entities in every country. DHL does, but not IT services ourselves, so we don't have employees in every single country. we have to rely on either our business IT or our suppliers to do that support for us. So that's quite huge, as well as because we don't have legal entities, we can't procure infrastructure in the country directly. We have to rely on either our business unit or our supplier to procure that infrastructure. So there's a huge benefit there for the supplier on that part. And lastly is a cohesive service. This can be argued both ways, but the way we see it is if we want a cohesive service globally, then by doing it internally, we can standardize on a single vendor across the globe. If we do it externally, there's no way we're going to get all of those vendors to agree on a single technology. And that's kind of an issue. So we have to overcome that hurdle if we're going to outsource the service. So that's about it. I mean, our next steps here is we need to continue to finish those proof of concepts so that we understand the technology better. I think that overlay to underlay communication has become extremely important. Then we need to continue to build that cost-benefit analysis. We need to come up with a subset of sites per region that we can look at internet and MPLS and the cost of the managed service as well as the cost of the infrastructure. That's probably something that telegeography can help us out from a circuit and internet costs, I imagine. And then we need to evaluate that sourcing strategy. We need to look at the flexibility of those contracts. Are they going to be agile enough to make the changes as fast as we need them? Are they going to be flexible enough if we see a change in technology because the market is still maturing that we can do that and that cost be borne by the supplier and not by the customer? And then lastly, we need to make that decision forward. We need to finish that proof of value estimation and provide that to our business units and decide how we go forward. And with that, that's all I had. I think there's a lot there. It seems like kind of a big, daunting task. What I would probably say is that, we need to be careful. I think there's due diligence that we definitely have to do as organizations, but we have to be careful to try and not architect towards perfection. We need to look at what we can do today so that we can take advantage of some of those benefits that we have. Thank you for your time.